All right, ladies, we're going to continue our notes on Chapter 12 material. I did update the Chapter 12 outline on Moodle, so if you want to pause and go grab that outline before we go any further. But this screencast is going to begin with one more topic about women's rights reform, and then we'll switch over to temperance. So I just wanted to touch on the fact that women themselves did not agree on female reform. You have some women who actually oppose other women in their efforts to gain more equality in society. And there's a famous debate actually between two well-known women, both writers, Catherine Beecher, pictured on the top left, and Angelina Grimke, pictured on the bottom left. And their names are spelled on the screen for you. Beecher basically accuses Grimke's abolitionist efforts as well as her female rights efforts to kind of fall outside of the sphere of female duty. Basically saying by taking on these roles of trying to reform society, reform government, it's not your place as a woman to do that. And you're ignoring your female duty and responsibilities. And Grimke kind of countered Beecher and said, whatever is right for a man to do, it is right for a woman to do. So she's actually quoted as saying, whatever is morally right for man is morally right for women to do as well. I believe it's a woman's right to have a voice in all the laws and regulations by which she is to be governed. Basically saying, well, if men could be abolitionists, if men can advocate for some of these reform efforts, why shouldn't women be able to do so also? And so I just wanted to kind of touch on the fact that, the issue of female activism and even women's rights in reform efforts is not something that all women even stand behind at this point in history. Okay, we're going to transition really quickly to our last Northern reform effort before switching to Southern reform, and this last one's going to be temperance. Temperance is another way of saying the banning of alcohol, or the desire to want to limit and ban alcohol. Alcohol is something that was heavily used and abused in the 1800s by adults and youth alike. Some interesting statistics, not that you need to memorize these numbers at all, so please don't feel like you have to write them down, but just to kind of put it in perspective for you. By the year 1825, it said that the average American who was 15 years of age or older consumed roughly 7 gallons of alcohol per year, which would be over 100 8-ounce glasses. Just to kind of show you the effects that temperance and that movement is going to have on trying to limit that number. In 25 years, that number will go down to less than 2 gallons per year, so less than half, really less than a third of the amount that was initially consumed by adults and adolescents alike. And the reason the temperance kind of movement is going to develop at this time is because many people felt that alcohol was the reason behind lots of demoralizing activity and kind of just the dissipation of society. For example, things like domestic violence at home, joblessness, accidents when you were on the job, people falling away from the church and kind of forgetting their faith. Alcohol was blamed for a lot of those things in society. So one organization called the American Temperance Society, ATS, is going to develop in the early 1800s. And again, they kind of their mission is to kind of encourage the reduction of alcohol consumption. Women are a large part of this as well, as it's kind of alcohol was associated for a lot of domestic violence incidents, and women want to kind of limit that, obviously. So because it is effective, because of the lowering number I gave you earlier in that statistic, you do know that the Temperance Crusade will be effective in kind of minimizing the amount an American adult would consume of alcohol per year. But like long term, we're not going to see like prohibition efforts until the 1900s, but we'll see that in a later unit. Something just to consider as well at this point in history. This is where we're going to see replacement drinks kind of pushed, such as coffee. Okay, believe it or not, alcohol used to be what woke people up in the mornings, and now people are going to rely on caffeine rather than their touch of alcohol to get them alert and get them through the day. All right, we're going to talk about Southern reform efforts now, which are going to look a lot differently than what's happening in the North. But just a few kind of key events, and then we'll transition to kind of an expanding country, even more so expanding tomorrow or Tuesday in class. Okay, so the first Southern reform we're going to talk about is pro-slavery reform, which seems a bit bizarre. What do you mean pro-slavery? What I mean is reform efforts initiated by those who supported slavery in the South. And these are movements happening within the South. So, as you can imagine, most people support slavery in the South. So how are they wanting to reform slavery? Essentially, you'd have religious leaders or evangelicals in the South sometimes criticizing slaveholding, but more often than not, even religious beings in the South are just trying to find ways to kind of consolidate their religious faith with their racial beliefs. Like, how do we sleep at night? How do we make sense of this? Like, we don't want to abolish slavery, but we know that there needs to be some sort of religious connection or morality made here. So how can we have both of these things exist in our lives is kind of the question you have religious people in the South asking. So what you have is evangelical slaveholders will come to regard the act of ministering to slaves as the purest expression of their faith, and kind of their calling within this kind of slavery, slave society. So how are they ministering to the slaves? What are they doing for them? Ministers would encourage slave owners or masters to improve the physical treatment of their slaves, basically threatening them with potential church or social sanctions if you didn't. So they kind of promote this idea of you need to, physically treat your slaves better. It's okay to have them, but you need to watch how you physically abuse them. That type of abuse will not be tolerated. Another kind of aspect of reform here, slaves couldn't legally marry under the Southern law, but evangelicals regarded this as a violation of the proper relationship between men and women who have children. So you'll have religious leaders pushing to allow for black marriage to take place in the South. You also have female religious leaders advocating for the protection of female slaves from sexual abuse, because that was something that was commonly done to female slaves in the South. Another main reform effort of this mission is they wanted to allow, and the ministers wanted to allow slaves to fulfill their basic, Protestant obligation of reading the gospel. Well, the thing is, in order to read the gospel, in order to read the Bible, you have to be able to read. And many southern states had made it a crime to teach slaves to read and to encourage literacy, because they were afraid what type of rebellions maybe could potentially take place. So they're trying to limit their ability to read, but the ministers are saying, no, listen, limited literacy is not a threat. A converted slave could be more obedient and wouldn't pose a threat to society if they have religious connotations. Like, we can make this work in a more civil way. So that's kind of examples of pro-slavery reform, again, just done by religious leaders who are still supporting slavery but want to see some reform done to make themselves feel better about the whole practice. And when talking about Afro-Christianity, we're going to kind of talk about the effect of allowing allowing the African American slaves to Christianize themselves and to become religious beings. Within the 1850s, at least 25% of all Southern blacks would participate in churches. Slaveholders initially kind of intended to control their faith, development of their slave population, but that's going to fail. By the 1850s, Southern evangelical churches, particularly Baptist and Methodist, which again are the most popular, had become major institutions in Black American life. And going a step further, which is really not what the slaveholders wanted, but the idea behind Afro-Christianity was the equality of all people and the promise of eventual deliverance and freedom. And that kind of idea is why you see large numbers of blacks kind of supporting these efforts and developing their faith in society. Now, Nat Turner is going to be an example of the slave owners' fear that by Christianizing their slaves, things could go wrong. And they will, with an event called Nat Turner's Rebellion. So essentially, Nat Turner is a slave in Virginia. He educated himself as a child. He hoped to be emancipated one day. He develops a strong faith within, Christian society, and he becomes a Christian. And he has this vision, and he feels that God is personally calling him to end slavery. He is eventually going to lead a violent slave rebellion. The way he kind of does this is he earns the respect of local whites. He had been preaching. He had been allowed to preach to their slaves. Unbeknownst to them, he was also spending years praying and searching for the right ways to fulfill this obligation and just waiting for the right moment. And in the 1830s, he will find that moment as he has a group of friends and kind of just some of his followers basically join together in a violent rebellion where they kill dozens of white families, or individuals anyway. I think like 60 people total died. He was hoping that the rebellion would gain support as it progressed and eventually turn out to a full, national scale rebellion. But it did not get the support he wanted, and eventually, of course, the white militia will put the rebellion down in Virginia. Turner himself is captured and hanged, so he doesn't get what he wants, but this is kind of what some, slaveholders fear by allowing their slaves to become Christian members of society. Are they going to start embracing ideas of, equality and the equality of races, and is that going to just give them further ammunition to want to fight for the abolition cause? In terms of anti-slavery reform, very few Southern whites are pushing for abolition at this time. Slavery is really the key link holding, the Southern economy together right now. They are very much relying on it and feel very connected to it. They want to protect it at all costs. But you do have Southern politicians kind of preventing congressional discussion of abolition. You have federal postmasters in the South preventing the circulation of any kind of abolitionist material in Southern mail. So this is just ways that they're kind of limiting even the ability of abolition from coming into a bigger movement in the South. Now, the Grimke sisters, Angelina we talked about earlier, her sister and her are two well-known former Southerners. I say former because they don't stay in the South, but that would, fight for the abolitionist cause. Now, they had to abandon their family, their region, and move from Charleston, South Carolina to Philadelphia before they could fully commit to abolition. And they began to write openly about abolition. As we kind of discussed in the earlier part of this chapter, they were, Angelina herself especially was a key abolitionist who was a female. But how are Southerners perceiving these types of people? As traitors. The Grimke sisters are perceived as traitors. Anyone in the South, really, who tried to advocate for the abolition or emancipation cause was deemed a Southern traitor. So overall, this is not a very popular reform effort in the South at this time. That was very much rooted in the North. Okay, if you have any questions, please write this down, and I will see you all in class on Tuesday. Have a good rest of your weekend.